Quick introductions. My name is Naledi Muleo. I will be hosting the program this evening, and I'm really excited. I am a news anchor with SABC News. As journalists, one of the things that we pride ourselves most with is a sense that every day when we are at work in that newsroom, we feel like we are writing history as it happens. It is a great responsibility. Now, there's something about 2023 as we get to the end of this year that as a journalist, you almost get a few shivers through your skin when you really think about what this year represents for South Africa, for the world. The book that we are launching and celebrating today, Xi Jinping and a Thriving China-South Africa Relations in the New Era by Professor Dembe, speaks a lot about South Africa coming to the forefront of shifting global geopolitical changes, right? It's an important time. South Africa is at the forefront of how the world's power dynamic is changing. And a lot of that stage that we have today is because of our partnership with a country like China. So one thing about 2023 is it will go down in the history books, not just in this country, but across the world, as a year that saw power shifts that have been in place for centuries really start to take a 180-degree turn. So I'm very excited to look at the history, the current, and the future of South Africa and China relations. And I really hope that as we have this discussion in the room, you feel free as well to engage, because really what this is about in partnership is about shaping that discussion. As we step forward in the global stage, we need to be critical and really start to chip away at the position that we take. I want to start off with not doing all the interactions because we are, of course, being hosted here by Freedom Park, a very important place for South Africa. And so what I'm going to do is ask Dr. Utsile Nzwane, the head of the Freedom Park, to give us welcome remarks. Please give him a warm round of applause.
But why the radio the television differently from me. It is not always the case that we are brought to digest the toil that starts with thinking, goes through the typewriter, goes back to the eyes, and goes to the print. So at Freedom Park, we deal with history of creation, the myths of creation. Our first entry point is giving you an African perspective of creation. We are saying African origins and our perspectives counts in evolution, and therefore we start by saying this is how we perceive where we come from. And one of the things that we are putting there is that we are the people that come from the roots. Hence, the highest structure in Freedom Park are the reeds that lights at night, up there the Garden of Remembrance. Because that's very symbolic about our own understanding of where do we come from. Now, if we say we come from the reeds, there must be water. So, this side, there's a lot of water that is going around at Sintlach, the nest. But up there, there's also water that is flowing there. But then also, we are the people that started fire. So we're using fire at sanctuary as a symbol, eternal, to symbolize those who were killed, murdered, disappeared, their bodies could not be found. We know their names, and therefore, because we didn't find their bodies, we can't inscribe their names on the wall of names to be remembered. One of them is T.H. Masinyi. But through this museum called Kapo, which is a dream, we've got various epochs. But I want to go to the one that links us with China, the industrial epoch. Because if you look into South African industrial history, you get mining. So we are depicting the relationship of China very early during the industrial period, where mining became a very important aspect of linking their understanding of the technology. So our museum has got a section dedicated to Chinese laborers who came here to South Africa. But because of that part, we're looking at where are we now? We are not in that area of industrialization. So as Freedom Park, then we have got to understand the technology. So this is an interpretive museum that's got panels where you can self-guide yourself and get the history, and so on. So I want to interrupt myself and remind those in the 90s who were playing bubblegum. And then ask the person who died, saying that Romeo wa Mokolota. Senyaka, when he said, di rasa, di you know that song? Now, we were listening to this song, by the regular, di rasa, by the regular machine, di fongkong, di fungfu. Now, that was a popular culture. And we were dancing to it. But we never cared because you continue to buy the very things that we said they were coming from there. But today, through the evolution of knowledge, South Africa's relationship with China is based on quality, both at knowledge transfer, both at industrial transfer, but also in terms of the investment for future growth and development. So Freedom Park epitomizes that type of a relationship because we also have another area of international solidarity during the anti-apartheid. And we've got that relationship with China that is recorded, how China contributed towards our liberation struggle to where we are. It's a democracy. So what Freedom Park stands for, it's a variety of epochs of history. But then because I'm welcoming you to an event that is about the launch of the book, I came across the author yesterday, not accidentally, because there's nothing like accidents or coincidence. The universe always brings us here. Because I parked my car, I walked in here, I find him, we connect, and he says, can you do the welcome? So as a head of department for heritage and knowledge and responsible for the museums and the interpretation and the content development, I agreed to this. I refer now to chapter 5 of his book about peoples to people. So Freedom Park is a museum that promotes peoples to people. When you come here, you can relate with the story. You can relate with we are not imposing our display. We leave them for interactiveness. So a tour guide must also hear what the visitor has to say. Because ours is not descriptive, but it's interactive. So it's very different. In so saying, the CEO is not in, the acting CEO promised to come around. Mr. Radichaba, you are welcome at Freedom Park. Two things very important. Do visit our site, starting with the museum. But for now, the easy accessible exhibition, it is that site by South African Gallery of Legends, which talks about heritage, art, sports legends. It depicts those, when you see them, you remember their contribution. Just to see that Masikela, a lot of things come to your head. So one feature of a portrait can just say so much in remembering. You are welcome at Freedom Park. I don't have words for you, Prof. I have words for your guests. You are going to enjoy the knowledge production, and Prof is a person who does with knowledge ordering. He orders knowledge to be understood. You didn't choose a wrong place. You choose the right place to be here. Because we also resonate with the story that you have written. with the passion and compassion that you promote China-South Africa relationship. Also as a museum, we do that. You are welcome. Thank you very much.
Dr. Nzwane talked about Prof. Dembe as the cooker of knowledge. And I think before we actually invite the Prof up onto the stage, I want to do this. I'd like to invite up in front of us Professor David Munyai, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Good evening. I was saying to my brother that he's one of those few people who can easily summon me to come here. I just landed this midday. I was in China on the Belt and Road Initiative Conference. So I'm really glad to be here. I engaged the book before it was launched, went through it. So I'd like to say a few things in relation to the book and South Africa-China relation. I think one of the key issues as we contemplate and engage in international relation, one great thing to do is to step back and look at history. Even though I'm in international relation, I'm guided by history. Yes, the early 1900s, the mining that has been mentioned of Chinese workers who came here. Not only did the Chinese workers come here, they were also in the United States, those who follow. They were building rail in America. As United States started enacting anti-China immigration laws, that's why when you go to United States, at every corner you find a Chinese restaurant. You ask yourself, why? That was the only business they were allowed to do in America. They were not allowed to do anything else. They were literally banned from doing anything else in the United States. Here, they were also expelled. Majority of them taken back home, and we're left with few who would become South African Chinese. So we have that strong history. But from party politics, let's go to 1927. Joshua Gumede, one of the outstanding ANC leaders, made a statement at Cape Town International Airport. I mean, just picture this. Black man at Cape Town International Airport, 1927. He had returned from the then Soviet Union that he had visited in 1923. He said, I've seen the new world. I've seen the new Jerusalem, meaning the Soviet Union. And at that time, it was few years when the Bolshevik had seized the then Soviet Union to establish what we then called the Soviet Union. And what he had seen, where there is no tribalism, race issues, gender, post-1917 revolution in Soviet Union, he was referred that in relation to South Africa. Quite deep. It's a famous statement. Cold War it was before Cold War. I've seen the New Jerusalem to a people that was yearning for freedom. 2018, and even now, 2018, I had a visit to China, invited to see. And in some of their industrial parks, even this visit, I also visited the Shanghai Industrial Park at the island. I was thinking about that. I've seen Jerusalem. Gumedi's Jerusalem was more political. In my own humble way, the Jerusalem I saw now, it's an economic Jerusalem. But the bigger question that I'm battling with is how do we get there to that economic Jerusalem? China, since 1949, attained political freedom, underwent enormous crisis, sanctioned. The opening was only 1978. In 1976, Chairman Mao had died. You had the history of the Gang of Four and the transformation in terms of attempting to realize that socialism is not inherently pro-poor. It's not a poverty policy. It's all about putting food on the table. And I'm making this in comparison to our own 1994. Our own Joe Slovo also said, with the end of the Soviet Union, 1990, famous paper, he posed a question, and that question hasn't been answered up to now. Has socialism failed? We need to revisit these papers. They are important. And constantly ask the question, what is it that the Chinese have done? And we are battling. I wouldn't say we've failed, but we're battling to get there. We're battling to fulfill from political freedom to economic freedom. And therefore, when we talk about China, some of us, you're constantly criticized as if you blindly follow. And the answer that you read the book and you engage Professor Tembe, you realize that there is a need to constantly realize that there are certain aspects within China, political and economic, that is useful to our condition. And within that context, there are certain aspects that are not conducive to our setting. And therefore, I think our role is to tease out those similarities, those areas that is suitable. And I'm particularly interested in education, locking in the urban and rural and close the gap, and the science and technology. If there is any country in the world in the history of capitalism has managed to cross that bridge, is none other than China since 1949, particularly the last 30 years, 40 years or so. And a very simple policy, which we really, I think we send lots and lots of delegates that go to China, and I always ask, what are they doing? And then when you arrive in China, political parties, civil society, scholars ourselves, they take you to rural areas and they show you exactly what they do. And I battle. I even asked Chinese comrades, you don't need to take our people to go in schooling in China in terms of at the party politics level. Let's have this engagement here. And I'm glad in Tanzania they established a school, Julius Nyerere School. At a party level, the nationalist movements across the continent, what does it take to translate the political freedom to economic freedom? What do you need to do at policy level. So here's what Chinese did. They believed in themselves, first and foremost. And they started from a rudimental ABC. The first small thing that you see in China that amazes me, went to a primary school, I saw the map. And in that map, China is right at the center of the map. And that's not the map I'm used to. Then I asked, what is it with your map? And why is China right here? They said, no. You start with yourself. I mean, you look at the map that we have, Africa is right at the bottom. This is the way we educate our children. We don't center ourselves. We always think peripheral. You always think you are not at the heart of world history. So, education. Free, elementary level, crèche, primary, secondary school. Technical skills. Teaching people ABC to just able to do and sustain yourself. Now, realizing that capitalism is inherently exploitative and it has a lot of pitfalls. They link the program of infrastructure, massive infrastructure development. Roads, they were blessed with rivers, rail, a digital gap closed. And what the most amazing and more fascinating for me is to ensure the fiber each and every household in the rural area. Now the questions are asked, is there a need to go to the urban area? There's no need. Your products in your garden, here it's ShopRite, social grants, straight to Pick and Pay. There is no view that the small garden, you can do veggies and cabbage. You don't need to buy cabbage at Pick and Pay. You can do it right there. So these are some of the key issues. But to think beyond that, to think space, to think satellites, to think and link that not just for the sake of doing it or showing power, but to uplift the people from poverty. Massive work is being done. And I think we need not to just visit China, but we need to take some of the lessons that are conducive to our condition and ensure that we do that. For us to attain economic freedom, the new economic Jerusalem, we need to ensure that we learn not just from China, even from the West, but ability to be assertive, confidence in ourselves. And no one else is going to free us other than ourselves. So in the interest of time, please engage the book. It gives a rich tapestry of this relation between South Africa and China. On that note, I thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Monyai. Please, Prof, if you will take a seat on any one of these chairs here. Of course, just avoid one of the middle ones so that we can keep that for our star of the day. And as we bring up our guests, what I want to, and I'm going to introduce them all one by one. Prof, if you can, please. Just a second, Prof. This is what I wanted to do. When I received the book, and I have to say this because it's important, yesterday I turned 36, so I officially am no longer part of the youth. But when I received the book, I still was. I still was youth. And one of the things I said to Prof when I started going through the book was, this is not just a compelling book, but it's an accessible book. That's important, because when we write history, we have to write it for somebody who's going to take it forward. And I think it's important that even as we have this discussion, we involve young people and the future leaders of our country to be part of it as well. So I'm going to invite Tariq Lala to please join us on stage, take a seat in one of the chairs there. Tariq Lala is, of course, with the South African Students' Congress. Please give him a warm round of applause. And then the reason why we are here. I actually am quite excited about what we're going to be doing today because I'm keen to really get you to engage, Prof. When we started preparing for today, I realized there's very little that you can't ask Professor Tembe. But let me introduce you to him. Professor Tembe is professionally fluent in, listen to this, English, Mandarin, Portuguese, Kiswahili, Swedish, Sesotho, Xitsonga, and isiZulu. It's incredible. If there's ever been a man that certainly is globalized, it is Professor Tembe. He is, of course, a senior lecturer and a researcher at the Department of Linguistics and Modern Languages at UNISA, with academic interests ranging from historical studies, performative and linguistic theories. He has a master's in Kiswahili studies from Uppsala University in Sweden, a PhD in Chinese studies from the Chinese University of Hong Kong in China, conducted research and taught at among others, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Stellenbosch University, Rhodes University, Uppsala University. Please give him a warm round of applause as he takes the stage. I know that even as we have this discussion, and I should have started with this in fact, but I know that if Dr. Nzwane can also join us on the stage as well, so we can have a more rounded discussion as well. But I want to get started, and I'm going to take a seat. I'm going to hand you this microphone. Firstly, Prof, I'm sure you'd like to say hello to everybody. You are the reason we're here.
Good evening, everybody. Why does one write? You don't write because you want to be a hero, you want to be a star. You write because you have questions yourself. And the three main questions that have conducted me or that have led me throughout my life is what, where, how, and when. To answer the last one, when is now? When is now, and I'm speaking to the LSM youth, hit the ground running. I'm 61 years old. We are going to die very soon. Then the youth will have no point of reference whatsoever as to where is all over the world. The world is already one place, one solid place. My dear colleague, Prof. Munyaye, just yesterday, less than 24 hours, was in Shanghai, a vibrant metropolis of East Asia. Now is here today in South Africa, within 24 hours. And he's not tired. He might be tired physically, but because of dynamism and the inputs that you get, let me mark this, inputs that are relevant to our own society. Now, the what is easy is well-being of our people, our nation. The last one is how. Now, that's where the devil comes in, because the devil is in the details. How? We've had RDP, ASGIZA, RREER, NDP, not because we want to ridicule those initiatives. Why don't I look into South Africa? It is because it's taking too much time, and whenever I travel around the world and I make comparisons, comparing variables that has made these nations a success, guess what? We are more suited to those successes than those nations. I'll say it openly. In terms of weather, in terms of demographics, in terms of resources, in terms of our own geographical setting, we're better suited than China to develop. Newsflash, 1998, China-South Africa bilateral relations. China was envious of South Africa's highways. China was envious of South Africa's communication systems. But today it's vice versa. Let me take a tangent. The new Beijing airport, which is one of the biggest in the world, the engineering of the tarmac was done by South Africans. Until today, in terms of economic tools, South Africa still beats China financially in terms of tools, not the trickle down of the GDP. No. Now, the question of how, that's what leads me then. I'm a human being and we're all envious. When I'm in Sweden, I say, how do I transport Sweden to South Africa, but still respect my South Africanness? When I'm in China or Korea, I say, how do I transport these successes? The notion that you can wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and just walk into a bar, walk into a karaoke, and then come back home walking without any worry. How do I transport that serenity? That serenity. But because we are scholars and we calculate, I then use the current leader of the new era of China, President Xi Jinping, on how he's steering this ship for it to continue success. Maybe it was easy for Deng Xiaoping, the Secretary General, to be able to change the course of China, for Jiang Zemin to change the course of China, for Hu Jintao to change the industry of China. But at this point, when China has reached the level of the world, the window through which you can see what is happening, it is the maintenance by the current leader, and not only maintenance, but progressing to an extent of surpassing all other greater economies. So those are the three questions. In terms of South Africa, then I discovered bottlenecks, which are 5, but I'll only mention 4. One of those bottlenecks we are dealing with it here today, lack of public awareness. We are not aware what is happening in the world. We are waiting for our month-end paycheck. Are we in a trance? Am I going to render my whole faculties as a human being to put X's on an Excel paper because that is my job, then to hell with the rest? Let us know the world, because when you know the world, then you get ignited. And as part of the profession and as part of what is happening today, as we saw on the video, the 13 consecutive years of greatest trade between China and South Africa and China and Africa compels me to even look deeper into China. What is China doing? What are the leaders in China doing? One thing that I discovered, then I discovered that there are so much similarities. It's not funny to use a simpleton or quoted language. And these similarities are a response, or they are relevant to the very same place where we are. Down here we have Isivivane, which is a communal place. To those who understand Nguni, we say, Faga es vivanene. In general English, which can never translate it directly. That's why in Italian we say, traidore traduttore, treacherous translator. But I will try. We are a communitarian society. You don't become a people before you are a person. But there's a struggle between a person and a people. There's a constant struggle of umuntu wanting to be abantu. You as umuntu alone, you cannot just be in a void. That's what Isivivane means. A little challenge, meaning that your salary is not your salary. Some have tried to call it black tax. That is a good start, but our salaries are not our salaries. Now, if you take this rationale and read China, a place whereby if the government says, let us have a fund for schools and everybody give 100 rands within 24 hours. What will happen in China is that the majority will give no below than 10,000, even 2 million within those 24 hours. Now that takes us to something else. Two things. It takes us to the issues of identity. What is a South African? We can sit here for 10 years in this room discussing that issue. What is a South African? Is it a configuration of the many? Or is it an amorphous amoeba? Or is it a forced unity? Because either of these structures, when you try and take them, they must have functionality. In the same way that the Chinese interpret harmony within Confucianism as one of the stratum and the hierarchy in order to drive society, even within us, we've got a couple of clusters and containers with which to run our government. But we have a problem. In order for us to get educated, to get into the corridors of power, we have to unlearn the locals where we were born and the first words were written into our bodies. Even the movement of you wearing ibheshu, as your bodily hexes, uyiqaba ufundanga, when you are a general secretary or you are something else, an accountant, a lawyer, an advocate, you even change your walk, you change the way you talk, you have a twang because you are getting bored. You have to unlearn in order for you to be productive within the world that is not yours. So that's the one. So what does that tell you? We live in the schizophrenic society. And how do we change that? Yes, I'm Mr. Tembe, blah, 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 my qualifications and all that and all that. And you are respectful in those corridors. You go home. What is the schizophrenia? But don't be quick to judge yourselves. We dealt with motions of democracy without democracy. You ask other nations, I'm using the word without democracy, when it doesn't deliver to the communal table. In all other revolutions, including the Chinese one, there are 3 points of democracy. People must eat, people must work, people must be educated. Yes. And there must be one line of command. But let us not be quick again to blame South Africa. With all these goodies and benefits that we have from our own geographies. That is the word, geographies. We've got 3 kinds of geographies. You've got physical geography, where you grow up, that paints and shapes you. You've got second geography, which is the mental geography, which is impacted by the original geography, which you seek in order to become a professional. That's the schizophrenic sense. But the most difficult geography is geofence geography, that even if you leave Sandton, Umlazi still sits within me. I carry the key to my Porsche, but on the side there is an okapi. I'm not laughing because I'm laughing. I'm laughing at the picture that I'm seeing. So, why do we maintain these geographies that are so murderous? Because these geographies, if we leave them, they will become a norm to our grandchildren. It is from that window of liberation that I look at China. It is from that window of liberation that I try to quiz and tease the guidance of President Xi Jinping into making China to continue to be a nation that it is. And fortunately, we have China as one of our greatest friends. Thus, in all my writings, I say, we have low-hanging fruits. How do we get access? Because they are here in front of us. I won't go into details because all of that is in the book, and the rest we'll get it during questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that is a very powerful way for us to start. I think that, Prof, when a lot of what you've touched on is about identity, and I think what we've done in this country is, I suppose across the world, a lot of us attach our identities to religion. And then there's a global argument about whether or not does Jesus exist, right? Just indulge me a little bit, right? How many of us believe that Jesus existed? Okay. We have no consensus there, right? And we can agree to disagree on that one. But in the book, Prof. Dembe puts forward that, well, even before Christ, Africa and China traded. And I found that very, very difficult to picture what that looked like. If we're still arguing about what Jesus looked like, what did trade between Africa and China in 202 BC look like, Prof?
See, I nearly said Jesus exists. Speak of inception. Books are written by victors. Books are written by the hunters, not by the prey. Books are written by predators. I've heard some people say that South Africa is not free, yabadi, yabado, yabada. If we can write our own story. I can't believe that we can then say we are lazy, we cannot write. Especially in the now. In the now where the point of reference is needed. It was the 13th, 14th century leading to 15th century. China was the god of the seas. But even before that, China was part and parcel of trade that relied on the monsoon rains, which was the Arabic trade all the way to Mombasa, all the way to the north of Mozambique in Sofala. But as China had more inventions, they then invented the compass. The compass then enhanced their sailing techniques. So the gods of sailing in the world were Chinese. One of the most spoken by voyages are those by the unique general, Admiral Zheng He, which during that time in China, it was Ming Dynasty. But the trade was so booming to an extent that most of silver was in China with people trading with China. But it happened that during the Ming Dynasty, the emperor at the time closed China from high seas. Now if you look at the date, I'm talking about 14th century, it is only then that you've heard about Bartholomew Diaz, Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama. Coincidence, Jan van Riebeeck. That span of time, when the big boss leaves the seas, or leaves world trade, actually, we can put it in that way. But if we trace sea voyages, especially of Admiral Zheng He, they go all the way to Kilwa Islands, which is east of Tanzania, go all the way to Mombasa, and go all the way to Sofala. Now, there are lots of artifacts that were discovered. And that trajectory was followed by the one that Professor Munyaye mentioned, with the miners coming to Southern Africa, which was followed by another wave in the 70s, which culminated in the wave of the year 2000 with China's going out policy. But luckily for South Africa, we already had good bilateral relations with China. That is why most of the biggest companies from China, they have their city here in South Africa. So connections that we have today are a continuation of what our great musician, the late Jonas Gwangwa, calls temporary inconvenience. Because we've been reading history from another victor. But fortunately now, we're not reading history from a victor. We are reading history from our own choosing. It reminds me about one of the greatest fathers of black consciousness. I write what I want. But luckily for us today, it's no longer revolutionary writing. It is writing as guidance, because when you write from history, but you tenuously look at loopholes and opportunities ahead, because today's war is no longer war of guns. Like Einstein said, he said, I know there'll be a nuclear war, and I don't know who will win. But warning to human beings that the war after that, the Fourth World War, will be the war fought with sticks. Thank you very much.
Do keep your mic on, Prof, because we're going to keep engaging you. I wanna start moving forward and coming closer and closer to where we are right now from a time point of view. In page 23 of the book, and if you'd like to follow, you may go ahead and do so. In page 23 of the book, I think Prof. Munyai also touched on the Cold War and really the shifts that we started to see, what we saw pre the Cold War, and now we'll get into post-Cold War. In page 26, the Prof writes about the romanticism of Cold War solidarities. Prof. Dembe says, the turn of the 20th century required new strategies for China-Africa relations beyond and away from the romanticism of Cold War-era solidarities. One basic reason for abandoning such a motion is that most liberation movements had become de facto ruling parties and governments in their respective nations. Hence, a new type of decorum and engagement was required that would build on past solidarities to create new alliances according to post-Cold War requisites of more countries having a seat at the international table of nations. Prof. then goes on to say, South Africa was, for a decade after the establishment of China-South Africa relations, left in a position where its new partner, China, remained a blessing in disguise. I found it particularly interesting how you found optimism in that very difficult sort of way that that China certainly was seen post-Cold War. And in the book, you also talk about, really, the 90s being a very pivotal point for Africa and China relations because of some of the coincidences that you touched on a little bit earlier. Can we talk a little bit about what those relations really started to look like in the 90s? You've touched on the fact that we are, at that point in Africa, post-liberation countries. But we're still trying to figure ourselves out. What did we learn from China in that period, Prof?
What we have learned about China is steadfastness. Steadfastness in terms of the blueprint. Blueprint. I'm not singing praise of China here, but I'm finding a solution for South Africa. What is our blueprint? And one of the main facts or ways that one finds China's blueprint is in their form of governance. The form of governance that is tested, well tested. You don't just become a provincial leader. You start from a hamlet to a district to a village. Very few people will believe that China is a nation that grows on trial and error. Policies come out that, look, we have to achieve so much yield. And then there are different models by different leaders in the districts, in the province, in the hamlets, anywhere in the municipalities. And those that succeed, then they are tried in other spaces. Why do I mention this? It is because the proxy rhetoric, which today still manifests, by the way. It's manifests in the Twitterati world, but it manifests now. Today you are able to call it the battle of ideas or battle of narratives. So it means we've come up. There is another side of the story now. Whilst in the 90s, even translators of Chinese news outlets were Western countries here in South Africa. That was our source of Chinese news. It was not Chinese news agencies. But now we've come to a point where we've had Chinese news agencies be more proactive, being more dynamic. But why do I say that the proxy narratives were a blessing in disguise? It is exactly because China-Africa relation or China-South Africa bilateral relations, they came at a point where we had our own preoccupations. We were still trying to define. President Mandela is my father. How far do we go? That Desmond Tutu is our savior. What type of a nation are we going to have? Is it a federal state? Is it a unified provinces of South Africa? Is it a rainbow nation? It has not rained yet. Oh, yes. Rainbow process rain. I didn't do geography. Those who did, they'll tell you in details. So we were woken up in our sleep, not slumber, because we had our own preoccupations. But in terms of our global mark, in terms of our global representation, in terms of our global perceptions, we were regarded as this nation that has made a miracle to obtain freedom. And that was it. We didn't have tools to sit, represented, and act on what was happening globally, contrary to today. But at the time, as we were preoccupied with ourselves, with our national issues, there was this bombardment by those who were kings of the geopolitical landscape, because they were scared that as China moves on, then they were going to lose a foothold, as it is happening today. We've seen a couple of Western superpowers losing their foothold in several places in Africa. Gladly and fortunately for South Africa, we haven't had the same patterns of violence that we see in other areas. So that's why I say that proxy narrative woke us up to say, look, what is going on here? Why is this party so preoccupied by the presence of this other party? I think some of us that are sitting here today were the product of that. I was sitting, doing my engineering in Europe. I got more interested in that proxy thing, and fortunately I was growing old, so I went to China. First, China was developing industrially. I wanted to learn more. But instead, what I found in China, I found some similarities that we have in our salient culture, your Ubuntu, our silent culture of Isintu. Sintu, which is the practice of Ubuntu. Please, let's move away from the biblical thing of Ubuntu, singing Kumbaya together, Ubuntu, harmony, humanity, I clap you here, you give the other side. No, 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 no. I explained this succinctly in one of my books. There is no Ubuntu without Isintu. The two are interdependent. There's no Ubuntu without Umuntu, because Umuntu is the transmitter to the people which forms Ubuntu itself. That is contribution to the communal table of society. I'll keep on repeating this because that is what we are ignoring, and we're running and seeing the beauty of us as South Africans in the image of others. I think that I can unapologetically say, let us get rid of that rationale. That is why I make emphasis that my study of President Xi Jinping is to look at the methods. It's a window to look at a successful nation. So that's how the proxy narrative played into us. There is a small generation that was impacted by that, and thus one of my aims as a scholar or as an ordinary citizen is to replicate myself in terms of amassing and dissecting knowledge.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. You know, as you speak about, I suppose, the positioning of that proxy conversation where generations are concerned, certainly if you speak to the generation of now, and how they see how South Africa positions itself, you know, as either Western or global, sure, you guys have colorful conversations around that. And I want to bring you in because I'm keen to hear within student movements, my goodness, over the past 7 years, your generation has been so vibrant in calling for decolonializing the education system. Prof in the book speaks about how there was a global assumption that post-1994 South Africa would be Western leaning. I get the sense that that your generation still believes that we very well were in 1994.
I think first I should start off by saying that I wasn't born in the 90s, so I'm not familiar with not to make anyone feel old. But in saying that, I think the sort of political culture that we were born into as young people in the country today, it's very interesting, right? I think the reason I say that is because I don't necessarily see that political culture throughout history. It's something that's sort of unique to the circumstance that we find ourselves in. And so the discussion of whether, or at least where student movements and student ideas tend to find themselves, whether we are leaning towards sort of a more multipolar world, or whether we find ourselves still leaning towards the West, I think is very interesting, because on South African campuses today, it's very clear that you can see ideological divides. And that sort of discussion that we need to have between, you know, where is South Africa now and where do we want to position South Africa as the leaders of today and the leaders of tomorrow, is something that we tend to see both within the sort of partisan space, but I think also outside of that partisan space. And I think the discussions, I think from my experience, funny enough, tend to be more fruitful outside of the partisan space, where there's not so much of rhetoric and populist agendas, but rather more genuine concern about where we want to see ourselves and where we see ourselves now. And I think in saying that, we sort of where we find ourselves today is very interesting, where we're not completely against the West as a country. We don't completely want to kick out the embassies. And look, I mean, we have our personal views on that, and I think my personal views may not necessarily identify with the positions. But I think as a collective, it's been very interesting to see how South Africa has been able to position itself in global geopolitics today, given the fact that we are part of the shift towards multipolarity, and we are part of the sort of rising, developing world. But at the same time, we have not taken a hardline stance against what some may consider our former oppressors. And I think, for me personally, that means that at some point in time, South Africa will have to take that position, a hardline stance. And I think it's very important that we have the knowledge and the ideas to be able to make that informed decision. And that exactly speaks to the fact that we need to be able to access knowledge at a level at which every person, every young person, but every person is able to engage with it.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that point. And I think what I think you've said that's very salient, though, is that even while you do have the polarity in views in young leaders, that there is, you know, I suppose, a consensus amongst you all that, well, we all agree on what needs to be done to get things right in our country. And in the book, Prof, you do a really great job as well of not just painting and I suppose putting forward this idea of President Xi Jinping as not just, you know, an anti-Western leader. You position him as a global leader. And I think that's an important distinction to make. There's this view that President Xi Jinping is almost a dividing factor in global politics.
I'm a product of my own injuries, as all of us who are sitting here. We can deny it. We're a product of colonialism. We're a product of separatists, as others call it, apartheid regime. We're a product of having been fortunate or unfortunately lived throughout the phases when the agreements of the world were shaped in order for Europe, or the so-called first Western world, to have peace. And it is surprisingly then that when we achieve what we call our liberation and freedom, we then bow and become signatories of those very same statutes that excluded us by design. My appreciation of the current generation or the new type of scholars, even popular scholars, that are ascribing to President Xi Jinping thought, it is because of two issues. First, he is able to take an already developed China to a higher level. But another fortunate instance is that President Xi Jinping takes over when multilateral institutions are showing their true colors. Agency is more important and more primary than a system. A system can only survive as long as there's a conducive agency around it. That's why when I talk to the youngsters, especially the youth, I say it is your agency that will make your system fall. As long as you condone, you want to be part and parcel of the so-called social utility criterion of a certain system, you can't fight that system from within. You have to disengage. I claim to have readership because people read my book. If people stopped reading my books, I wouldn't be an author. I'll be just a madman sitting in an ivory tower. And there are many stories about those ones. I'm an author because there are people who are reading my books. I have a readership, which is not mine. It's a circumstantial and conditional readership. It resonates to your needs. It even resonates to the needs that you deny yourself because you want to be comfortable in an uncomfortable space. You get your first degree. After 3 months, you go buy a car. You go and buy a flat. God, you can't leave that job again. You see how your trajectory has changed. You belong to Deloitte and Touche now as a representative of a certain financial system, not as a company. Please don't sue me. Having said all of this, as the world was discovering that most of these institutions that made peace and unity and multilateralism at the expense of the food basket, which was Africa, as they were waning and no longer functioning, when the word fairness had changed because fairness had now included people of another melanin. The fairness of certain people with a certain melanin was okay and conducive as long as you didn't exist on that big table. Once you came to that bigger table, they became non-relevant to you, but they still favor those who made them. And yet you wanted to be signature of that. Then it is a fortunate moment that a person that he himself or that nation had been colonized, instead of joining, is established something else at the moment when those systems and institutions are waning. Global Security Initiative. Global Civilizational Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative. The other two, let me just take those 3 ones. Global Security Initiative speaks of defense for all nations in the world in an effort to create common prosperity and building a community of a shared future. Global Civilizational Initiative. It means each and every civilization in the world, be it a Maasai, nomadic pastoral civilization, matters because these have a certain form of abstraction. If a culture is a Maasai culture or as a Moro culture has lived for centuries, despite all the vicissitudes and the neglect at the periphery of the world stage, still sustain themselves today, there's something to learn from those civilizations. So I'm looking at Global Civilization Initiative as a step of totally abandoning the Cold War mentalities and abandoning spatially selective hierarchies of relations between people to people. Thank you very much.
Yeah, please go ahead, give him a warm round of applause. On page 41, you illustrate the point that you're making so beautifully. Right at the top of the page, Prof writes, when President Xi emphasizes civilizational exchanges, it is because no civilization is superior to another. Each makes its contribution to the collective storehouse of human knowledge and know-how. In his words, Xi explains that all civilizations are rooted in their unique cultural environment. Each embodies the wisdom and vision of a country or nation, and each is valuable for being uniquely its own. In a stroke of philosophical chutzpah, he concludes that each civilization is the crystallization of human creation, and each is beautiful in its own way. And if seen in this light, civilizations don't have to clash with each other. What is needed are eyes to see the beauty in all civilizations. So beautifully put, none superior than the other. See beauty in all civilizations. Dr. Nswane, I'm going to bring you in here because you know the position was put forward earlier about you know who is South Africa. President Xi says, see beauty in all civilizations. Where are we faring here at home and being able to do and see beauty within ourselves? Prof asked earlier, is a South African unity and diversity? Are we moving forward in that argument or backwards?
It's ready. Thanks. There are titles of books. One of the titles of the books is Does South Africa Exist? Now, I have a copy of that book. I have not read it all, but I was interested in two aspects of that question, whether the author is successfully answering the question, does South Africa exist? Now, the second observation is based on archaeology and paleontology. Because when you go into archaeological studies, the excavations connects Sofala, Mapungubwe, and the China. When you go into archaeology, you get the Kaditsweni, city of Botswana in Zeerust. That was having 20,000 people in 1820. It was bigger than Cape Town. Then you also get Tulamela. I won't talk about the Zimbabwean ruins. But archaeology also tells us that there's been a connection of people to people and trade long before that. But when you come to when you come to paleontology, you can start a little bit early with Taun's son or Taun child, to be precisely. Then you go to the finding of Makapan's hut or cave. Then you go to what is now the cradle of humankind. Now, what does it say to us as South Africans? Forget about the geographic direction of our existence, South Africa. Think about what has came out of archaeological findings. But let me leave these Western studies, archaeology, paleontology, and any ology. Let me come to oral history. We've got idioms. Earlier on, I was talking to Lohol. We've got a story about Kodimodumo Sankata, Mushiana Sankata. Now, this folklore story about Kodimodumo. When you are 5, 6 years and you had been told about there was this thing called Kodimodumo and it swallowed people and they lived inside it, and this man got inside it with a spear and had to fight his way out of the inside of this big Kodumodum. It's a scary story. But recently you get people who are doing studies on bones, and maybe they're also archaeologists and paleontologists. They say Lesotho has got a very interesting typology of this animal that Basotho talks about, Kodumodu, in those mountains. We are not being discovered on the basis of our oral history and folklore. We are being discovered on the basis of archaeology, paleontology, Western studies on our ground. It has to take some secrets to be pushed out of the University of Pretoria to talk about Mapungubwe rhino, golden rhino. That was made by us. So we must be careful about what makes us as people. We must not be made by definitions of other people. Because that way we are going to be denied of our existence. Now, earlier on in the welcome, I said we are having a 3.8 billion years of life here in Kapo, the dream. We trace it far from there. Now, I don't know how old is the Garden of Eden, but we can say that we came before the Garden of Eden. Because in Barberton, we've got a sign of a stone rock. We have got a symbol here on the Stone Ages. That tells us about the oldest life in here. So your question is, I've answered it by saying we must not allow people to define us. But we must also have the courage to run away from school. We must have the courage to run away from school. And when you run away from school, it's because you don't want to be fighting issue of decolonizing. So you must not even get colonized. So run away from school so that you don't have to fight the battle with the tools of the oppressor. That's why I don't like decolonizing. I like endogenization and indigenization. When somebody says I'm decolonizing, I say, aha, you've got a problem. So we must talk about indigenization and endogenization. We must go to the story of Mushianyana Sankatani. We must go to Khodumodumo to bypass these archaeological findings of bones being measured. This is who we are. We don't know our greatness because we don't have the instrument to measure how far we come from time. We have been intercepted. China closed itself away from being intercepted. I told Prof yesterday that I read the Chinese Revolution. And I read about Mao Zedong, because they call him Mao Zedong. China closed itself from this nonsense. China looked inside itself, made a language that they can talk. Mao Zedong made a one language that people can communicate with. So we must also have time for ourselves. Let us withdraw from the noise. Let us have a moment of self-meditation as individuals, as country, as people, until we go to what he said a little bit earlier. This miracle of a nation makes it difficult to answer the question. He mentioned about that it hasn't rained yet. So it says that expression that we've got in Freedom Park here, the rainbow what of God, the euphoric expressions, we must withdraw as a country. We must imprison the writers. We must imprison the poets. They must now be arrested, be given computers and recordings. They must now write. They must be arrested. Equally so as they were political fighters for liberation, they were arrested. We must arrest poets, writers, historians out of the society and close up for about 10 years. Then we'll know who we are. Thank you.
Deny them freedom for freedom's sake. I understand. The Prof. Muya, you wanted to jump in.
You know, by the mere fact that I'm seated next to Prof. here, I think we need to, when you are saying run away from school, I think we need to perhaps qualify. Yeah, perhaps. Because we come from a very serious background. You can run with, you need to know what you're running from. It is quite critical that when we are running away, perhaps not literally running away, it's unlearning. The process of unlearning takes place. I think the very, you're at varsity, by the time you finish your degree, third year, postgraduate, you start now thinking and questioning a number of things, including your professors. So when you start to undo the damage that they're causing, you're already you are running. So yeah, perhaps we need to go there. But I think you mentioned Jesus somehow. I hardly speak, I think in my entire life, I can count how many times I've stood on a platform and used that name. There is a joke I got from a friend in relation to that. It's not a true story, but this friend of mine, Nigerian, he said, a brother from Africa goes to China, very, very religious, as most of us are. When he landed in China, met a Chinese brother, the first question he asked, he said, "My brother, do you know Jesus?" So the Chinese was shocked. He says, "Me? Jesus? No, I don't know Jesus. But tell me more about Jesus. I'll make Jesus for you." I think the point here is the Chinese brother was very pragmatic, that anything that you can talk about, you should be able to make it. So I think at times we get lost into certain ways of looking at the world. So it is important that we and that's why I like the conversation here, that we're looking at China, not to praise China, as my brother has already said. When Deng was asked about Mao, his answer was very simple. What do you think of Mao? I mean, this is a man that had locked him up like 2 or 3 times. But he answered very simple. He said, Chairman Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong when you look at cultural revolution and all the damage that it did to China. So I think our main aim is that as we continue in our history, abandon this idea that all your leaders are bad. Huh? The best leaders are overseas. All your leaders are bad. We should be able to, I mean, including Churchill. I mean, if you know Churchill, he slaughtered more people, millions and millions, Indians who were denied food. And when Churchill was asked about how history look at him, his answer was very simple. He says, history look at me positively. He said, why, Prime Minister? He says, because I'm writing it. I'm writing that history. And all what we read about Churchill is what he wrote himself. So it's important that we look at our history, and see what is working and continue so that there is no breaks in our history. We correct the mistakes made by other leaders. We continue and in that road to perfection. But perfection could only be seen on the table. Is there enough food on the table? So if the table is becoming empty, there is no leadership. And leadership does not mean union buildings. It means everywhere across society, including yourself, ourselves, all what we're doing. Are we contributing in bringing something? In other words, are we pragmatic to say all what we learn, whether it's the past, and all what we do, we turn and translate it to ABC, which is a road to travel well without potholes, kids going to school, and then they get water and electricity. And they are guaranteed that they will get home safe. That's basic answers we need to answer, all of us. And when we talk about leadership, or when we talk about revolution, because we make a mistake when we're in party. I mean, I was also in the student movement. So revolutionary that to a level that you don't know exactly what is it. You can only change what you measure. You need to measure what you do. And you count. And then I think the more pragmatic we become, the better our society becomes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to just add one more speaker onto our panel. We are going to welcome onto the stage Mr. Mlondolozi Masuku, who is Deputy Secretary General of the South African Communist Party. Please, ladies and gentlemen, give him a warm round of applause. He's just landed from the airport, so. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Masuku. And we're going to bring you in a little bit later, Mr. Masuku, because what I'd like to do is, we've done a lot of talk about symbolism, and when Prof and I were prepping for this discussion, This is really, you know, this is the fun stuff, you know. Well, at least it feels like it. We enjoy. But the difficulty is, what now, you know? We certainly have had the emotion, the discussions around what we feel, identity, how we view ourselves, how we learn from our partner China from that, and vice versa. But at some point there has to be nuts and bolts here. Again, the 15th BRICS summit in August. You know, the bated breath around whether or not BRICS is going to expand. What is going to happen? Oh, this is exciting. Bated breath. If it does, who's going to be in there? Then the announcement that yes, 2024 we will see an expanded BRICS. And I got a call from a friend of mine, excited. This is great news. It's exciting. It's a new world in 2024. But what does it mean again? What do we get for it again?
Let me just move very fast, because this is not only a question to me and my book, which is our book. It also teases other questions on the role of party-to-party relations. Because what is happening here, we're seeing South Africa, in a practical and natural sense, punching some doors. Because by mere fact, let me take the story from its beginning. During the Belt and Road Initiative, most people said, which coincided just after South Africa joined BRICS, South Africa was called the smallest economy, the smallest demography. What was South Africa's contribution? Which was a very naive question from geopolitical perspective, because we are a region, we are representative of a specific region. But speaking on the expansion of the BRICS, it is not the replacement. It is not an alternative system too, but it's the growth of a new system as the Global South or South-South cooperation finds means to organize itself at peace. There's no longer a need to go and pay allegiance somewhere. For example, there is the currency system of BRICS. We call it CRA, the contingency the contingency money, that if the rand were to fall up till a certain degree vis-a-vis the greenback, then the CRA agreement will get in to support the rand. Public awareness, people are not aware of that. So what is BRICS doing to us? BRICS allows South Africa to be part and parcel of a bigger system. Not only BRICS, FOCAC as well. These are opening inroads for South Africa to have access to a type of economy that is not driven by the former masters, but an economy that is driven out of necessity of nations that were kept at the periphery by design. South Africa is not poor. The continent was not poor, but there was a design in place, starting with the Marseille, the Versailles, whatever agreement, until the 60s, until the Cold War. That was by design. And that design is yesterday's wind. We have a new design in place, but please, not as an alternative, but as born of us. To cite Doc here, Dr. O, in saying that, don't talk to me about decolonization. I existed long before colonization. My birth song was sung millions of years before colonization. If I'm going to speak decolonization, it means my own identity and my embryo is defined, my own existence, by colonialism. I don't think I'm going to decolonize myself because I was never colonized. I'll tell another story, which is an anecdote. And many people are going to say, what? I've lived in Europe for a couple of years. I've lived in Asia for enough years. I always tell myself I've never felt racism. for one reason. I'm in other people's country. I'm a stranger. I'm a guest. It is their nation. I understand their rules. I understand their decisions. I do there what I do, what I need in accordance to their laws, and then I come back home. Maybe at home I might feel racism, but even at home I've never felt racism. It was legislated that I was nothing. Maybe that's why I was forced to go to school. And that is the geography that I talk about, that we have to live. So what have we gotten from BRICS is the inroads to dignified nations in the world, should sit on the international table with other powerful nations. That's what BRICS has given us. Now, upside down, what are we doing with those low-hanging fruits? Again, it means we have to put our house in order. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Powerful point, Mr. Masuku. I think this is a great time to bring you in. I heard Dr. Nzwane earlier, just when we were arriving, saying that the chapter that Prof wrote about people-to-people centered leadership on Xi Jinping, an important one. I think the party-to-party chapter, relevant as well. Within the book, I found it quite striking how massive, policy and in fact, massive economic shift was very much intentionally a political party initiative. And there's something that needs to be said, right, where the people can certainly see the SACP and not see what the SACP offers, even as it is part of the tripartite alliance, what it offers about vision for a bigger future outside of being the Communist Party. So let's talk about the importance of political party here and really starting to say, well, we need to be intentional even within that space.
Thanks very much, and apologies that I had to come late. There are some reasons I cannot elaborate. But yes, the importance of political parties derive from a family. If you understand the importance of a family, and you understand that the family is actually built by different components, different people with different views, and the progress of this family is the richness of the ideas of the whole collective and with respect to each other. It will then give you a sense that the importance of being in a political party, it means that there are certain values of that family that you must follow that brings in discipline. You have just raised an issue earlier on. What is the meaning of these BRICS and what we do about it? The question is, it's a good thing, but do you just celebrate it? And I saw Dr. Pale Luhutla here, and you will agree with me that it's not enough to celebrate and to keep on celebrating this event. The issue is, how do you organize yourself as a family to make sure that the relationship with the next family is actually improving your production in your relationship? So ourselves as the party, the Communist Party of South Africa and the CPC, we have got also that relationship. We do it every 5 years before they go to Congress. We have a conversation. And even now, when we elected ourselves, the first Politburo went to China to just go and interact with them to look at why are we different. We established at the same year, 1921, but we are so advanced and we are so backward and so behind. What is this that we are missing out? And what we miss out is consistency and vision and consistency in keeping that vision and ensuring that everybody works on it. If we talk about modernization, which is what the Africa relationship is based on, and President Xi Jinping has been spoken about. Do you know that it was set in 1975, and the principles were set there, and they were consistent? They say in 15 years, we're going to modernize ourselves, we're going to make ourselves a social, democratic, socialist country, and that is advanced, that is progressive, and we're going to then industrialize, and we're going to set up, and they follow that intimately without missing their way. So their relationship with any other person outside themselves is to advance the thought and the kind of plan that they have had than being influenced to change it. So it's something that we need to really deal with even in our terms. And we're sharing with our alliance, the ANC, to say in this renewal that we're talking about, we must also deal with that aspect. We are not existing for ourselves, we are existing for the connection with the people. If you look at the center of their policies, whatever we're doing, if it doesn't impact on the people who don't exist, are we existing as the SACP? Are we existing as the ANC and the Alliance under this situation where people are so poor and there are many challenges? The answer, you'll get it. Thank you.
So as a writer, I've done my work. Secondly, we've spoken about modernization. What we seek is a type of modernization which is framed around our culture. Not that we go back to Kogamapeshu, but I'll repeat again and again and again, communal table. I once mentioned some groupings in South Africa who use that communitarian. They contribute 100 rands every month. Today they are building universities. But if I were to sit here and say, how many quarts of Black Label you drink in a weekend? And we've got 35 million beer drinking men here. If I said, sacrifice that 20 rand, how many billions we have in one weekend? But I'll have a very group of clever blacks and some clever whites going to the court of rights because I'm invading their private space. Is there a system for youth to become youth and grow? Yes, there is regimentation of youth, but that again will be against the current constitution because you've got your private rights that are even above the community that paid for your school fees and brought you up. Your rights are your rights. You have a right to go and buy your golf, then help educate your siblings. So what I've had here today as just a boy from Umlazi is that we need social engineering. Because going totally back doesn't work. We're already injured. And as I've said, focusing on the carcass won't help us. Let us keep what we have learned, Doctor, from the bad situation of colonialism, from the bad situation of apartheid and exile. But let us retrace some silent values, as I call it in one of my books. A greeting in a community tells you what that community is. Sawubona, it means I see you and your soul and your contribution. So don't be false to your own greeting. If I'm to be redundant and go back to China, in the way they move as unism, their main greeting is, have you eaten? Not because this person wants to buy you lunch. It is because if you've not eaten, it means there's something wrong in society and you become a weak link of the communal building, of achieving those skyscrapers within 2 weeks. I buy a garage or a mechanic shop. I call you as my brother to come and work for me. And you will tell me straight, square in the eyes, we are Dagwa Wena. Who do you think you are? Now that you've got some sense, until we become one, there'll be no Ubuntu. Until we become one, there'll be no practice of Isintu. Thank you very much.
Please give Professor Paul Tembe a warm round of applause. I'd I'd like to thank you all so much for participating in this discussion. Take a book home, share the words, and share, of course, the knowledge of the book as much as possible. Let's get this book into as many hands as possible. Give yourselves a warm round of applause, and thank you for joining us. Dinner is served.